Climate change, changes in the Earth's biosphere, its impacts across space and time are unprecedented. And climate change will mainly be about water. Droughts, floods, ocean acidification, cyclones, much of it is about water. And this year, water has been in the news a lot. You may have seen the stories coming out of places like Cape Town in South Africa, and the so-called day zero approaching because of the lack of local water sources. If you've been paying particular attention for the last few years, you may have seen a lot of stories coming out of South Asia, facing water crises every summer around where people have to line up for hours because there's a lack of local water sources. And those same regions, a few months later, facing monsoon floods, bringing on a different kind of water crisis. And you may have also seen maps such as this, quite scary and make you think, oh no, is the world actually going to run out of water? But while it's true that climate change is altering the global water cycle, changing some of our assumptions around droughts and floods, the sort of simple linear narrative that climate change will inevitably cause water scarcity, make the world run out of water, is not totally accurate, at least not for the most part. See, climate change and water issues, or hydroclimactic issues, are primarily questions of justice. They're about who has water, who does not, and why. Take, for example, this quote from the UNDP in 2006, where they say there is more than enough water for industrial use, for domestic use, for agriculture. The problem is that some people, notably the poor, are systematically excluded from access to water because of their limited legal rights. In short, scarcity is manufactured through political processes and institutions which disadvantage the poor. So climate change and water issues are primarily about justice. Climate change, on the one hand, is universal. We will all feel climate change, and in that way it's slightly different to many of the other problems in the world. However, it's differentiated in terms of who has produced many of the causes of climate change and how climate change materializes. Danish Mustafa, a geographer at King's College, had an interesting way of putting it. He said, climate change is a boat that we're all on. Some of us are in first class, while many of us are in third class. When the boat sinks, it's the people in third class who will sink the first and the fastest. And it's the people in first class who will have access to the lifeboats. So people feel, and the materialization of climate change is differentiated. There's a vast difference between a rural tribal woman in central India and a rich urban citizen in South Delhi, or a black working class woman in New Orleans and a rich white Silicon Valley professional in California. Gender, class, caste, race, geographical location, all of these factors differentiate and mediate how climate change impacts are felt. So we need to think carefully about how climate and water impacts are, who's affected by them, how our legal, economic, and political processes produce these injustices. And I use the word produce specifically because I want to suggest that these things don't just happen. They're a deliberate result of economic, legal, and political processes. As the legal thinker Anna Greer put it, climate change is essentially a crisis of human hierarchy. Hierarchy between humans and hierarchy between humans and the wider environment, or non-humans. It's not an unorchestrated scarcity, as the UNDP pointed out some 12 years ago, but produced through many of our institutions and many of our laws. And it's this idea of justice, or practices of injustice, that got me as a lawyer to start thinking about these issues. To look at and propose how laws and human rights could be the answer to addressing some of these injustices. Human rights and law have always been central to questions of justice. Human rights have been seen as a way to trump particular bad laws, to check power. They're seen as a way of having an emancipatory potential in them, to give people a human right to health, to give people a human right to water, to give people a human right to food, is to give them a universal claim to a particular necessity of life. And water is the stuff of life. Its importance has seen it elevated to an internationally recognized human right, and perhaps more interestingly, in many of the countries that we see experiencing some of the worst sort of climate and water effects, such as South Africa, India, Bolivia, the human right to water has been recognized for a number of years through laws, constitutions, and court judgments. However, while it's enjoyed widespread recognition, and everyone is sort of recognizing that we do have a human right to water, what it exactly entails, how it exactly plays out, is still not set in stone. And there lies the opportunity for us to think about ways that we can safeguard this right, strengthen this right, reimagine this right for coming challenges. Because for the most part, while governments have recognized human rights, the way that's being practiced is to primarily provide taps or tube wells to provide a small amount of drinking water to a particular population. So say there's 250 people living in a particular area, the government will try and provide a tap to provide a quantified metric of how much water they think each person needs for their basic drinking water needs. Now, apart from the problem that this itself hasn't adequately been supplied everywhere, it also leaves a problem about whether it's fit for some of the scales of injustice that we see happening today and that we will see in tomorrow's world. What other factors do our laws and institutions have to take into account? Let me try and put this all together through looking at some sort of real-life examples of how laws, climate change, water, and injustices play out, and then we can start to think about how human rights can be reimagined, strengthened, and recognized. So first consider the many scenarios that we see today where people are dependent on water tankers coming in to provide them drinking water because they run out of a lack of local water sources. This happens in many countries around the world, for example in India or South Africa, where there has been a groundwater crisis for a number of years. Groundwater is essentially the water that's underneath the soil, which is accessible through digging boreholes and the like. This reliance has come about because of a lack of surface water resources. Surface water, your rivers, your lakes, your ponds, and so on. And those resources have either been overexploited or they're overpolluted. And in a country like India, for example, the rules around groundwater, so the laws around groundwater, are hugely unjust. They allow anyone with land to basically dig as much water up from underneath their land as they want. So they have a free rein to dig groundwater. So what does this mean? It means if you're poor, if you're marginalized, if you're the vast majority of people without land, you lack access to this groundwater. It means that if you are a landed farmer, a rich landowner, you suddenly have a lot of water access and a lot of power with that water access. As the water table shrinks, those with more money can invest in bigger drills, continue to tap into water as it goes down. It means that certain people can dig without consideration for others, their neighbors, and also the wider environment. Perhaps the epitome of this was about 10 years ago when Coca-Cola, it basically sucked a village dry in southern India in the state of Kerala. And it was brought to light through a long and brilliant struggle by the villagers of India, villagers in this village, who basically brought a very big litigation case against Coca-Cola. But even then, the court was kind of left scratching their head, saying, well, actually, Coca-Cola did have a right to continue to drill under their water, under their land. So in times of erratic rainfall, which climate change we know will bring, those with more money can continue to have access to this water, begin to dominate and control others. It perpetuates this huge injustice you see almost every summer, where those who are poor and marginalized have to be dependent on those who are rich to buy water sold in those tankers that I showed you. Let's now consider how the governments have primarily been recognizing or actioning this human right to water. It's often, as I said, putting taps to provide a certain amount of water at a certain time of day to a certain population. But this is a completely narrow framework in terms of the daily struggles people have over water. Firstly, putting a tap in a particular area doesn't reflect the fact that people often have to line up for hours to get that water. at that point, it's about different social factors in terms of who gets access to that water that comes out of that tap at a particular time and who doesn't. Secondly, it doesn't reflect the fact that for many of the world's rural poor, their water struggles are about drinking water, but also about a number of things that they need for their basic livelihood. Water for growing food, water for feeding the sick, water for feeding their livestock. And these basic livelihood needs, which go to the heart of people's development and their dignity, are not reflected in a narrow framework which just focuses on delivering a small amount of drinking water. And they, of course, tie into other human rights, the human right to health, the human right to food, and the human right to the environment. Often this lack of recognition means that people who get this small amount of drinking water have to ration that little bit of water to feed their livestock, to grow food for their families. Moreover, the overwhelming burden of water falls on women, and this is not reflected through this narrow sort of bureaucratic statistical approach to the human right to water. Because it's women who have to go fetch water for hours in the day, taking up most of their day to get water for their families. It's women who are tasked with the disproportionate burden of in a water crisis. So again, another layer of injustice which can't be simply captured in a single narrative of climate change making water run out. Now, this is a photo that I took myself last year when I was on my PhD fieldwork in the eastern part of India. And this is a particular area where sea level rise is basically coming in, swallowing large swathes of land, swallowing people's homes, their water sources, their farms, and so on. One of the important issues that people face here is around the embankments. Those are those mud walls that you see, basically built of mud and bamboo. And they protect people from the sea coming in, wiping out their houses and their lives. It has huge impacts, as you can imagine, on people's lives and livelihoods. But the decisions around the embankment, who owns them, who maintains them, who funds them, how they're fixed, all of these things are primarily controlled by the state bureaucracy, and people, especially the poor and marginalized, have very little control, very little ability to partake in the decisions around the embankment. And this is because of embankment laws, which go back 50 to 100 years, which are completely top-down and have been completely absent of a human rights-based dialogue in terms of the scale of injustices or injustice that we see today. What about the issue of some people taking too much water? This is a river, again in India, which is completely dry. And this happens for many reasons. Because of mining, sand mining, water for agriculture, water pollution, dams which change the structure of rivers, and so on. If climate change is bringing erratic rainfall, how much more can we continue to allow our laws and regulations and legal processes and political processes to allow this kind of thing to happen? Can a human right to water only be about providing a small amount of drinking water, or does it need to also include something like a right to rivers of a certain quantity, of a certain quality? Do rivers themselves have this right, if we think beyond just human rights? And finally, whether it's the people in Eastern India, if it's women in Mekong, if it's indigenous communities in South and Central America, the ones who we see at the end of the day facing the first and the greatest brunt of hydroclimatic injustices had very little to do with causing it. Does the human right to water then not also include some sort of negative right or negative obligation that people shouldn't be able to pollute, which affects people's human right to water? Pollution not just in terms of water pollution, but also carbon pollution. And can we not think beyond just sort of local or national boundaries and start to link up global, national, and local scales? So, how do we move on? I don't have any quick fixes. There aren't any quick fixes. But I can suggest a few different ways I've been thinking about and looking at reimagining our human right to water. Firstly, it's through recognizing a broader human right. The human right to water can't just be about drinking water and statistics around drinking water. Because drinking water is one of many basic water needs that people need. We need to recognize that in large parts of the world, people need water for livelihoods, for growing food, which are immensely important to people's well-being and dignity. It's also important to recognize that the many different ways people experience water scarcity through gender, class, caste, race, and so on, and work these into our laws when we're thinking about implementing the human right to water. Secondly, it's recognizing that water is a common resource that we all hold. It means that no one has the right to own water, or no one has the right to own water based on land ownership or having more money or land. A well-regulated commons means recognizing water as our common heritage based on our stake as humans, as animals, and as part of the larger ecosystem. And it also means responsibilities towards water. So third, recognizing the right to water means recognizing responsibilities. Responsibilities not just to not pollute water, but also think about other forms of pollution which have an impact on water, such as carbon pollution. And fourth, to emphasize that the human right to water is linked to many human rights. Human right to health, the human right to food, the human right to environment. You can't just deal with them in silos. And to move on from just declarations at the international level and start looking at many of these laws at the national and local level that I talked about, which are completely absent from a human rights and climate change-based dialogue. And finally, we need to remain critical and imaginative. Continue to critique laws and institutions that manufacture and produce these water and climate injustices and perpetuate injustices, and critique narrow framings of human rights. But also be imaginative in the ways we can frame, ways we can use human rights, not just in terms of laws and policies, but also in terms of activism, politics, and claim-making in the pursuit of justice to overcome some of the unprecedented levels of water and climate injustices that we see.